My name is Danny Halloran. I'm 36, a hospice nurse, and 4 weeks after giving birth, I bought the home I'd dreamed of my whole life, a quiet place to heal with my daughter. First night, boxes still taped shut, my mother called. No congratulations. Just, "We're moving in tomorrow. I don't do rules for my grandchild. Your sister's family's coming too. Don't like it? Leave. Leave. My house. My name on the deed." Ordered out by the woman who'd called me good with the dying. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I said, "Okay, Mom, come at noon." What she didn't know, her own mother, the woman she'd called too far gone to know anyone, was asleep down the hall. And she wasn't gone at all. The next day they barged in to take it all. They froze in the doorway, every one of them. I'm going to tell you exactly who was waiting in that house and how a woman my family had buried while she was still breathing ended up holding all of them in one room. But if you've ever been the one nobody listened to, the helper, the afterthought, the one who overthinks, stay with me, because I'm telling this for you. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I like knowing who's in the room. Let me take you back. The phone went dark in my hand, and the kitchen went quiet the way only a brand new house can. No creak it had learned yet. No ghost of anyone else's life in the walls. Around me sat the boxes I hadn't opened, my daughter's name spelled out in marker on 3 of them. Maeve. Down the hall, a sound machine pushed soft static under a closed door, and under another door, a different kind of quiet. I set my mother's voice down with the phone. Then, I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and took out a business card I'd been carrying for 5 months. I didn't read it. I knew it by heart. I just turned it face up on the nearest box and looked at it until my pulse came back down out of my ears. "Okay, Mom," I'd told her. "Come at noon." Noon would tell them who I'd become. In my family, I was the helper. That was the role I was handed before I could read, and nobody ever asked if I wanted it. My sister, Stephanie, got the wedding with 200 guests and a husband who introduced himself by his returns. I got the apron. Stephanie married Trevor Maddox, a wealth manager who could make a dinner table go silent just by mentioning his spotless record, and who, somewhere along the way, had quietly become the man who managed my grandmother's money too. My father, Gary, governed the family the way he governed everything, from behind a coffee mug he lifted whenever a hard question came near, like a man checking the depth of water he had no intention of entering. And my mother, Carol, ran the whole performance. She was the woman who organized the church potluck and wept at other people's funerals and told the room how much she gave. To me, she gave a job. The last family dinner I went to, willingly. She handed me a stack of plates the second I walked in. Across the table, Trevor was explaining compound something to my father, who nodded at every word he didn't understand. I carried the plates. When I came back, my mother touched my wrist with 2 fingers, like petting a dog you weren't sure about. "You're so good with the dying, dear," she said, smiling for the room. "Not everyone's cut out for more." Trevor laughed without looking up. "Leave the numbers to people who understand them, Danny." I stacked the next set of plates. I didn't say that I'd held the hands of more people through their last hour than anyone at that table would meet in a lifetime. I didn't say that good with the dying was the kindest accidental truth my mother ever told. I just cleared the table because that was what the helper did. And the helper had learned a long time ago that arguing only extended the meal. They thought the apron meant I was soft. They thought the new house, the baby, the hospital bracelet still on my wrist, meant I was finally small enough to push. They thought the house made me weak. The first time I understood that being needed and being loved were not the same thing, I was 10 years old, standing at the front window watching the family car back down the driveway without me. It was summer. There was a cooler in the trunk, and my sister Stephanie's pink suitcase strapped to the roof, and my father at the wheel, checking his mirror. And there was me, in the doorway, holding a list of my grandmother's medications because my grandmother had the flu, and somebody responsible had to stay. My mother rolled down the window. She didn't look guilty. She looked proud of me, which was worse. "You don't need a vacation," she said. "You're the responsible one." The car turned the corner. The house went still. I remember the kitchen clock more than I remember crying. That flat plastic tick, 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 slow as a faucet, while a blanket that smelled like menthol and my grandmother's powder sat folded over the back of the couch. I learned a lesson at that window that took me 25 years to unlearn. I learned that care could be a punishment. But I didn't spend that week alone. Down the hall, propped up on 3 pillows with a box of saltines and the TV guide, was my grandmother, Ruth Calloway. And when she heard me crying in the kitchen, she called me in, and she patted the edge of the bed until I sat, and she took my hand and squeezed it 3 times. Slow, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. It was a code we'd had since I was small. I never even remembered learning it. It meant, I see you. It meant I'm here. Ruth was the one who taught me how to read a person. Not their words, their hands, their breathing, the way they got quiet before they got honest. She'd been a nurse herself, before it was a thing women in our family were supposed to grow out of. When I told her, at 19, that I wanted to do hospice work, my mother had said, "Why would you choose that?" My grandmother just folded my fingers into a fist around the idea. "You see people, Danny," Ruth told me. "Don't let them tell you that's small." When I was 12, she took me 3 doors down to sit with a man named Mr. Petrosky, who was dying of something slow in a back bedroom that smelled of liniment and toast. I was scared of him. Ruth didn't tell me not to be. She sat me on a hard chair by the bed and told me to watch his hands, and his breathing, and the way his eyes went to the window when the pain came so he wouldn't have to wear it on his face. "Words lie," she said. "Hands don't." We went back every afternoon for 2 weeks. The day he died, his wife held my grandmother in the kitchen, and Ruth held her right back, steady as a fence post. And I understood for the first time that there was a kind of strength that looked like softness from the outside. I decided, on that hard chair, what I wanted to be with my life. My mother would later call it morbid. My grandmother called it a calling, and she was the only one who ever used my own word back to me without flinching. She kept her own pills in a blue weekly organizer on her windowsill, lined up Sunday to Saturday, every dose accounted for in her own steady hand. She used to tap the lid and say a body's just a schedule you have to keep. For most of my life, that pill box sat in that window, and I never once thought about whose hands it might someday end up in. Ruth was the only one in that whole family who ever looked at me and saw a person instead of a pair of hands. She was the only one who ever saw me at all. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday in July, alone in a clinic bathroom, holding the edge of the sink. The man I'd thought I was building something with did not stay. I'll tell you the whole of it in 2 sentences, because that's all it deserves. He said he wasn't ready, and then he proved it. After that, the other side of the bed stayed made, day after day. And I stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a tooth that's already gone. Only the tongue keeps going back. I worked my shifts. I came home to a quiet apartment and ate standing at the counter and felt the first flutter of her at a red light, alone, with no one in the passenger seat whose hand I could grab. I bought the crib myself and put it together wrong twice. There's a particular kind of loneliness in building a nursery in silence, hauling the box up a stairwell while strangers hold the door, and I won't pretend I didn't sit on the floor of that half-finished room one night with a little screwdriver in my lap and the instructions blurring. But I won't pretend it broke me either. Somewhere in those months, I stopped waiting for anyone to arrive and arrange my life for me. I told my family at a Sunday dinner, I'd practiced it in the car. I said it plainly. I'm pregnant, it's just going to be me, and I'm okay with that. My mother set down her fork. For 1 second, I let myself hope. That's nice, dear, Carol said. Stephanie's redoing the kitchen, did you hear? Quartz? The conversation moved on without me, like a river moving around a rock. And somewhere under the table, my hand found my own stomach and stayed there. Because if no one in that room was going to be glad about this child, then I would be glad enough for the both of us. I made myself a promise that night, driving home with the radio off. I would build my own family this time. A real one, on my own terms. I didn't know yet that 2 miles across town, my grandmother was already disappearing, and that the people at that table were the ones holding the eraser. It happened the way these things always happen, slowly and then all at once, and with everyone smiling. Over the better part of a year, my grandmother went from a little forgetful to not herself to too far gone to know anyone, and the family narrated the decline like sportscasters. My mother started every phone call with a sigh, and the words, "I'm exhausted," caring for Mother, and Trevor, patient, reasonable Trevor, stepped in to help, the way he helped with everything, which is to say, he took the wheel. "Someone has to manage her accounts, Carol," he said at a family lunch I'd been invited to, so I could watch the baby of a cousin while the adults talked. He had a leather folder open on the table, papers fanned, a pen uncapped. "She can't keep track anymore. It's a kindness." I asked the only question that mattered. I asked who Ruth's doctor was and what they'd said, and whether anyone had ruled out anything reversible. My mother looked at me the way you look at a child who's interrupted. "You focus on the baby," Trevor said, smiling, capping the pen. "We've got Ruth handled." That blue pill box wasn't on a windowsill anymore. It was in my mother's purse, and she was the one filling it now. Handled is a strange word to use about family. I saw what they meant by handled at my grandmother's 90th birthday. My mother threw the party. Of course she did. There were people from the church, neighbors, a banner, a sheet cake with Ruth's face printed on it, in frosting. Carol moved through the room, receiving sympathy like a hostess receiving gifts, one hand pressed to her chest, telling anyone who'd listen what a journey it had been. She sent me to the kitchen to refill the lemonade. The helper refills the lemonade. And in the middle of all of it sat my grandmother in a wheelchair she didn't need, slumped, her chin near her chest, her eyes moving slow as syrup. A neighbor leaned down to wish her happy birthday, and Ruth called the woman by my dead grandfather's sister's name. Everyone laughed gently. Bless her. Bless I. My mother dabbed her eyes and accepted a hand on her shoulder from the pastor's wife. "It's the hardest thing," Carol told her, loud enough to carry. "Watching your mother go." Around the room, people nodded the way people nod at a brave widow, and I watched my mother collect that nodding like coins. Near the cake, Trevor stood with a paper plate, telling my father in a low, soothing voice that the estate side of things was all being handled, nothing to worry about, and my father lifted his cup and drank. I had spent 13 years learning the difference between a body that is leaving and a body that has been made to leave. The longer I watched that room, the colder I got, because not one person in it was looking at the woman in the chair. They were all looking at the performance about her. I crossed the room with a cup of lemonade and crouched in front of her and watched her hand tremble around the plastic. And I felt the floor tilt under me, because the woman in that chair was not sick the way they said. I'd sat with the dying for 13 years. I knew what the natural end of a long life looked like. This didn't look like an ending. It looked like a dose. My mother caught my eye across the room and raised her glass and mouthed the words, for the crowd, that she'd said into 100 microphones of attention that day. I'd do anything for my mother. I went home and couldn't sleep, and I started doing the thing I do best. I started watching, and the pattern, once I saw it, I couldn't unsee. My grandmother was at her worst on the days that mattered, before a doctor's appointment, before anyone came with papers, before anything that needed a signature. On ordinary afternoons, the ones nobody scheduled, she could sometimes follow a whole conversation. It made no medical sense. Dementia doesn't check a calendar. I asked Brenda about it, Brenda Cassell, the homemaid who sat with Ruth on weekday shifts. Brenda was the kind of tired that working people get, the kind that makes you careful. She didn't quite look at me. "She's easier to manage some days," Brenda said. Then she heard herself and reached for the dish rag instead of my eyes. I shouldn't say more. Why? I kept asking myself on the drive home, why would a person fog on a schedule? The answer was in a plastic box the width of my hand, and it was Brenda's bad luck and my grandmother's good luck that I was the one who finally opened it. It came down to a fall. My grandmother slipped getting out of bed one September morning, cracked a hip just enough to land her in the hospital, picked up a urinary infection there the way the elderly do, and came home needing real nursing. Wound care, medication management, the whole exhausting machinery of it. And my mother, who was so very exhausted, who had said anything for my mother into every microphone, took one look at the cost of round-the-clock professionals and remembered she had a daughter who did this for free. So I moved in for a while, and the first night, I sat at the kitchen table with my grandmother's medication spread out in front of me to set up her week, the way I'd done for 100 patients, and I read the labels. I read them twice. There was a benzodiazepine, prescribed for agitation, at a dose I wouldn't give a woman half her age. And there was an anticholinergic stacked right on top of it, the kind of combination that's printed in red on every geriatric warning list there is. The kind any nurse, any pharmacist, anyone who'd spent 10 minutes around old people would know turns a sharp mind to fog. 2 drugs that don't belong in the same week, let alone the same body, let alone a 90-year-old's. Given together, given daily. Given, I would later learn, a little early on the days company came. I read the 2 labels back and forth, like I was hoping they'd rearrange themselves into something innocent. They didn't. I knew these drugs the way a carpenter knows a warped board. I'd watched this exact pairing turn lucid patients into people who couldn't find their own bathroom. I'd argued with doctors to get patients off it. There are lists, long, boring, life-saving lists, that exist for one reason: to keep this combination away from a body like my grandmother's. Someone had put it there anyway. Someone had kept it there, refill after refill, while the family told the church what a journey it had been. My hands went still over the pill organizer. The kitchen got very loud and very far away at the same time. This wasn't medicine for a mind that was slipping. This was a leash. I didn't rip the box apart. I didn't call anyone screaming. I did what my training told me to do, which turned out to be the same thing my grandmother had taught me at that window when I was 10. I watched, and I went slow, and I made a plan. I called a geriatrician, not the family's doctor, my own, a man named Dr. Whitman who I'd trusted for years with my hospice patients. I laid it out for him, drug by drug, dose by dose. He was quiet on the phone for a moment. "Bring her in," he said, "and keep your notes." We tapered her off the 2 worst drugs over the next stretch of days, carefully, the way you have to with an old body, so the withdrawal doesn't hurt worse than the poison. And then I waited, and I watched my grandmother come back from wherever they'd sent her. It took about 2 weeks. The first sign was small. She asked for tea. Not in the vague way of the last year, but specifically the loose-leaf kind. 2 bags, let it sit. Then, one afternoon, she looked at the photo on her nightstand and named everyone in it, including the dog we'd had in 1991. Then she looked at me, holding my belly. I was showing by then, and her whole face changed, like a window catching the sun. "Danny," she said, "when did this happen? Why didn't anyone tell me?" I had to set the teacup down and put my hand flat on the doorframe for a second, because some things you can't carry standing up. Dr. Whitman ran his tests a few days later and came out into the hall shaking his head, not at her, at the chart. "There's nothing wrong with this woman's mind that 2 prescriptions weren't causing," he said. He almost smiled. "You've got the best set of eyes this old woman ever had." In those 2 weeks, I watched my grandmother come back the way the tide comes back, in reaches. She started correcting my tea. She started doing the crossword in pen again, the way she always had, daring it to prove her wrong. One evening she asked me to bring down the shoebox of photographs from the closet, and she went through them on the quilt, naming and naming, laughing at a picture of herself at 20 in a dress she swore had cost a week's pay. She found one of my grandfather and went quiet and held it flat against her chest for a while, and I didn't rush her. She told me she'd been afraid. She said that for a long time she'd felt herself going under, losing words in the middle of sentences, looking at her own kitchen and not knowing which drawer held the spoons. And that the worst of it was that she'd believed it, because everyone she loved kept gently confirming that yes, she was slipping. Yes, it was time to let other people decide. She had been getting ready, she said, to disappear politely, because they'd told her to. The worst part was the morning my grandmother, fully herself now, sat at the table and asked me, very quietly, what had been happening to her. "Where did I go, sweetheart?" she asked. She'd been awake under there the whole time. I sat with that for one full day before I let myself name it, because naming it changed everything. The forgetfulness, the fog, the slumping at her own party. It had a calendar. It had a schedule. And things with schedules have authors. For my whole life, I'd believed my family disliked me. The truth was colder and simpler, and once I saw it, the rest of the picture snapped into focus like a slide clicking into place. They didn't hate me. They needed me not to look. And if my grandmother's mind had been a decision, then so was everything they'd done, while she couldn't speak for herself. What if the decline wasn't a tragedy at all? What if the decline was a decision? I opened my notebook and turned to a fresh page, and I started writing down a name. The name belonged to Brenda Cassell, and the first thing I learned about doing this, the right way, is that you don't go in like an avalanche. You go in gently to people who are more frightened than you are. I brought Brenda coffee. I told her she wasn't in trouble. I told her, and I meant it, that I knew she'd been put in an impossible spot. A working woman following the family's instructions in the family's house, and that nothing that happened was going to land on her. And slowly, over the kitchen table where I'd first read those labels, Brenda Cassell reached into her bag and took out a spiral notebook with a coffee ring on the cover. "I kept it," she said, in case someone ever asked. It was a log. Dates, times, doses, every pill she'd given in her own handwriting, because Brenda had been a CNA long enough to know that the person who writes it down is the person who's covered. And there, in the margins of certain days, were notes she'd been told to follow. Give the evening dose early on visit days. Keep her calm before the appointment. There was an afternoon, Brenda said, turning a few pages back, her voice dropping like she was confessing it. They had her sign a stack of papers. Big stack. The son-in-law brought a notary. She shook her head. She didn't know the day of the week. She kept asking me if it was Christmas. Brenda's hands were flat on the table now, like she was bracing against it. "I almost said something that day," she told me. "To the notary. But your mother was standing right there, and I needed the work, and they kept calling it just paperwork, just making things easier for Grandma." She looked up at me then, and there was something close to begging in it. "I'm not a bad person, Miss Danny. I wrote it all down because some part of me knew. I just didn't know who I was supposed to give it to." I put my hand over both of hers, and told her she'd just given it to the right person. I asked what she signed. Brenda didn't know. But I did by the end of that week, because once you know what you're looking for, paper leaves a trail. Someone had had my grandmother sign while she was gone. I found the documents the way you find a tumor, by feeling for the thing that isn't supposed to be there. A power of attorney, granting Trevor Maddox control over my grandmother's affairs, dated the previous spring. A transfer of her investment accounts into vehicles he managed. And underneath it all, a quiet, ugly arithmetic. Money leaving her name. Not all at once, in pieces. Fees here, reallocations there, a slow bleed that added up, when I finally added it up, to a little over $400,000. $412,000. Her savings, the equity she'd spent 50 years building, drained in increments from a woman who couldn't have told you what year it was on the day she signed it away. And her house, the little paid-off house with the windowsill where the blue pillbox used to live, was listed for sale. I sat down at her kitchen table, the same table, and laid the pages out in a row the way I'd laid out her pills, and I read them in order. The power of attorney, the account transfers, the listing agreement for the house. I read them twice, the way I'd read the labels, and the second time I noticed my own breathing had gone slow and even, the way it does at a bedside when there's nothing left to do but be steady. I wasn't shaking. That frightened me a little, how calm I was. It was the calm of a nurse who has finally figured out exactly what is killing the patient. She signed everything away on a day she couldn't name. I stood in my grandmother's kitchen, holding a printout of a bank statement, and my whole body went cold and very calm at once. And I understood that this was no longer about whether my family loved me. This was about a 90-year-old woman and her home and $400,000 and a man with a spotless record and a leather folder. I needed someone who understood the numbers, so I found someone who did. Her name was Joan Petrillo, and she was an elder law attorney with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and a voice like a closing door. I sat across her desk with my grandmother beside me, lucid, dressed, furious in the quiet way old women get. And Joan listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. Then she took off her glasses. She turned to my grandmother first, which I have never forgotten. Not to me, to Ruth. "Mrs. Calloway," Joan said, "are you of sound mind today? And do you wish to revoke the power of attorney you signed?" "I am," my grandmother said, "and I do." Joan slid a single page across the desk, and my grandmother signed it, a real signature now, steady, revoking everything they'd taken with her own competent hand. Then Joan looked at me and laid it out the way you'd lay out tools. "Here's what we do. We revoke the power of attorney today. Done. We move to void the transfers, because a document signed by someone without capacity isn't worth the paper. We file a notice that freezes that house sale cold, and we report it to the people whose job is exactly this." She folded her glasses into her palm. "And here's the part you'll find hard, because you're a nurse, and you want to fix things in the open. You don't confront them. You build it. Then you let the paper do the talking." I looked at my grandmother to see how she was taking it. All this talk of fraud and capacity and her own name on stolen documents. But Ruth Calloway was sitting straighter than she had in a year, both hands folded on her pocketbook, her chin level. She had been a nurse herself for 40 years before the world decided women like her should retire quietly into the background, and she knew exactly what it meant to take a careful history and let the facts do the indicting. "Do all of it," my grandmother said to Joan, in the voice she used to use on doctors who talked down to her. "I have plenty of time to be angry later. Right now, I'd like to be useful. Build it quietly. Let the paper talk." So here's where I'm going to stop and ask you something, because by now, you know almost as much as I did that afternoon. A stack of papers. A woman who couldn't name the day. $400,000 and a house on the market. Knowing all that, what do you think they were really protecting? Tell me in the comments before you hear the rest. Then stay, because the answer was uglier than I'd let myself guess. There was a reason for the money. There was somewhere it had been going. The reason was sitting in a spreadsheet, and it took a forensic accountant to find it. Joan brought one in, a careful woman who spoke in dates and decimal points. And together we followed my grandmother's money the way you'd follow a smell to a leak. Most of it was straightforward theft, dressed up as management, but some of it wasn't going where Trevor had said it went. There was a pattern under the pattern, recurring charges, a second set of habits, money peeling off into places that had nothing to do with my grandmother's care and everything to do with someone's other life. Some of this isn't going where they said, the accountant told me, sliding a highlighted page across the table. There's a pattern. Hotels. The same one, twice a month. The money was feeding something else. I'll tell you how I confirmed it, and I'll tell you it wasn't clever detective work. It was an accident, the way the worst things you learn usually are. My sister Stephanie called me, of all people, to help her load donation boxes from her garage, because Trevor was traveling for work. Trevor was always traveling for work, and the helper helps. I was lifting a coat off a hook when a phone fell out of the inside pocket. Not his phone. A second one. Cheap. The kind you buy with cash. It lit up when it hit the floor, and I am not proud that I read the screen. And I will never forget what was on it. It wasn't just numbers. It was a whole separate life. Another woman, months of it, paid for in hotel rooms and gifts, funded, I now understood, by a 90-year-old stolen savings. I stood very still between two boxes of my sister's donated sweaters, holding a phone that belonged to no good version of anyone, and the garage went cold around me. Above me, I could hear my sister Stephanie in the kitchen, running water, humming, calling down to ask if I wanted coffee. I slid the phone back into the coat pocket, exactly where it had fallen from. I lined the seam up. I hung the coat back on the hook the way it had been. My stomach had dropped clean through the concrete floor. I called up that I had to get home to the baby, and I left before she came downstairs, because I did not trust what my own face was doing. The money wasn't just theft, it was a whole other life. And then, standing in my sister's garage with a stranger's phone in my hand. Stephanie's marriage was the next casualty, because my sister didn't know. I'd spent 30 years cast as the bitter one, the jealous one, the sister who couldn't be happy for Stephanie's perfect life. And standing there, I realized that Stephanie's perfect life was a stage set, and she was the last to know. The golden child had been just another mark. He'd taken from her too, in small ways she'd never questioned, because she'd been trained like all of us, not to ask Trevor about the numbers. I held a piece of evidence that would end my sister's marriage, and for the first time in my life, I felt no satisfaction in being right about her husband. I felt sick. Later that week, she showed me a necklace he'd given her. A thank you from a client, she said, fastening it, glowing, and I held my tongue, and I hated holding it. Because Joan was right. There was an order to this, and a time, and detonating my sister's whole life in a garage over donation boxes was not it. Stephanie deserved the truth told properly, privately, by someone who loved her, not used as a weapon and dropped. For 30 years, my sister Stephanie had stood on the right side of every family argument while I stood on the wrong one. And here was the receipt that proved I'd been right all along, and I had to hold it and say nothing. Part of me, an old, ugly part, wanted to walk into her kitchen and watch it land. I'm not going to pretend that part doesn't exist. I promised when I started telling you this that I wouldn't lie to you. But I'd seen what it does to a person to be made into someone else's weapon, and I would not do that to my sister. There's a difference between justice and revenge, and the difference is who you're willing to wound to get there. Trevor handles all that. Stephanie said, touching the necklace. I don't need to know the details. She was standing on a lie and smiling, and I let her for a little while longer because I had a plan and a calendar of my own now. And then the calendar got a deadline. Joan called me on a gray afternoon in the back half of March. The sale of my grandmother's house had a closing date. They'd found a buyer, and they were pushing it through fast, racing to turn the last of Ruth's life into cash before anyone could stop them. 6 weeks out. I felt the floor drop. Joan didn't. They've set a closing, she said, and I could hear her already reaching for a pen. That gives us a clock, and it gives them a cliff. We had a notice ready to freeze the sale. We had a capacity assessment from Dr. Whitman, current and retrospective to the day of the signing. We had Brenda's notebook. We had the money trail. Everything was nearly in place, sitting in a folder, waiting for the right room. Their deadline had just become their cliff. My daughter came on a cold morning in the middle of March, 8 days early and in a hurry, and the first hands that ever held her after mine were a nurse's. I named her Maeve. For 3 days in the hospital, it was just the two of us, and the beeping and the small, impossible weight of her. And somewhere outside those walls, a closing date ticked closer, and a folder waited, and a family planned a takeover they didn't know was a trap. But in that room, there was only her face, and the hospital bracelet on my wrist, and the realization that I had built the thing I'd promised myself in the car with the radio off. A family, a real one, on my own terms. A couple of weeks later, I closed on the house, the one I'd been quietly working toward all through the pregnancy, the small bright house with the deep windowsills, the one that cost $385,000 and every ounce of nerve I had. I signed my name on every page of that deed myself. The bank officer slid the papers across a different kind of table, a friendly one, and I signed and signed until my hand cramped, and every signature felt like the opposite of the one my grandmother had been tricked into making. Mine were mine. I read every line before I signed it. The nurse in me, the watcher in me, was never going to not read the labels again. When it was done, they handed me a single key on a paper ring, and I sat in the car in the parking lot and held it and didn't drive anywhere for a while. 4 weeks out from giving birth, stitches still pulling, a key in my hand to a house no one had given me and no one could take. I had bought myself a door I controlled, and I brought my grandmother home with me. Ruth had been living under my roof since the day she came back to herself. There was no version of this where I let her go anywhere else. We moved her into the room down the hall, and the afternoon we arrived, I carried her blue African violet to the new windowsill and set it where the light was best. A plant a hospice patient had pressed into my hands years ago, the morning she died, telling me to keep something alive. I'd kept it alive through everything. My grandmother stood in the doorway of that sunny living room, holding my 4-week-old daughter against her shoulder, and she looked around the room and then at me, and she squeezed my hand 3 times. 1, 2, 3. 3 generations under one roof, Ruth said softly, her cheek against the baby's head. They can't take this from us. For the first time in my life, the house was ours. What my mother, Carol, didn't know, what she could not have imagined, because she told the story of my grandmother's ruined mind so many times she'd come to believe her own broadcast, was that the woman down my hall was awake and lucid and lawyered and waiting. That was the state of things on the first night when the boxes were still taped and the phone rang. "We're moving in tomorrow," my mother said. "I don't do rules for my grandchild. Your sister's family's coming too. Don't like it? Leave." I held the phone in the dark of my new kitchen and felt the old reflex rise up. The helper's reflex, to soothe, to fold, to keep the peace at any cost to myself. And I let it pass through me and out the other side. I thought of a window when I was 10. I thought of a woman drowning in slow motion for a year. I thought of $412,000 and a closing date. "Okay, Mom," I said. "Come at noon." I hung up, and then I made one call. It was a short call. Joan answered on the second ring, and I told her my mother had just announced, in her own words, that she was coming to my house at noon with the whole family, and Joan was quiet for exactly one beat before she said, "Well, that's convenient." Because the room I'd been waiting for had just announced itself. I made the arrangements the way you'd prep an OR. Joan would be there with the folder. The Adult Protective Services investigator who'd opened the case, a steady woman named Garrett, was already scheduled to interview my grandmother, the alleged victim, and there was no day better than the one the alleged perpetrators had chosen to arrive. And the notice to freeze the sale, signed and filed, would be served the moment they walked in. Then I sat on the edge of my grandmother's bed, and I told her she didn't have to do anything tomorrow. She didn't have to perform, or prove, or even speak. "Tomorrow," I said, "you don't have to be anything but awake." Ruth folded my fingers into a fist around the words, and nodded. Calm as still water. Noon. Let them come. The doorbell didn't ring. They never ring. The front door opened on the dot of noon, and they came in like weather. My mother first, a casserole dish in her hands like a flag of conquest. My father behind her with a thermos, Trevor with his easy smile and his sunglasses still on, my sister Stephanie herding her 2 kids and an overnight bag. They came in talking, already arranging my house out loud, my mother's voice carrying ahead of her into rooms she'd never seen. "All right, everyone," Carol announced, sailing toward the hall. "Let's get the nursery sorted first, then we'll—" She stopped. The whole parade stopped, folding up against her back like cars at a sudden light. Because the living room was not empty, and it was not a frightened girl with a baby waiting to be told what to do. My grandmother sat in the armchair by the window, in the good light, dressed in blue, her hair done, her hands folded in her lap. Beside her sat Joan Petrillo, with a folder open on her knees. By the bookcase stood a woman with a badge, clipped to her jacket, and a man none of them knew stood near the door with an envelope. Ruth lifted her chin and looked at my mother with 2 clear eyes. "Hello, Carol," my grandmother said. "Sit down." The woman they'd buried said hello. I sent the children to the kitchen with juice and a tablet. Whatever happened in that room, it would not happen in front of them. Then it began. My mother recovered first, the way she always did, reaching for the script. "Mother, you're confused," she said, too bright. "She's off her medication. This is a misunderstanding." Joan didn't raise her voice. She set a stapled report on the coffee table and slid it forward 2 inches. "Capacity assessment," Joan said. "Dated last fall, and again last week. Mrs. Calloway is of sound mind, and was of unsound mind on a specific day in the spring." She laid the blue pill box beside it, then a spiral notebook with a coffee ring. "AIDS medication log. 2 drugs no one over 80 should take together, given daily. Given early on the days you visited." Trevor stepped in, smooth, hands open. "This is absurd. She signed willingly. I have the documents." Joan slid the next folder. "On the day," she said, 3 witnesses say she couldn't name her own kitchen." Bank statements, the power of attorney, the revocation in Ruth's steady hand. $412,000 in black and white, leaving a 90-year-old woman's accounts and going somewhere it should never have gone. Joan didn't read it like a list. She placed each page like a card, face up, and let it sit. Trevor tried again. He was good. I'll give him that. He kept his voice reasonable and his hands open, and he used words like allegations and context and happy to clear this up with my compliance department. He told the room he'd acted in his client's best interest. He said the accounts had performed well. He turned to my father for backup the way he always had, and for the first time in 30 years, my father had nowhere to put his eyes. Joan let him finish. Then she slid 1 more page across the table, slower than the rest. "You were her advisor of record," Joan said. You had a duty to her, not to the family, to her. She tapped the page once. This is the date you moved her retirement accounts. This is the date on her capacity assessment. Same week. The woman by the bookcase, Ms. Garrett, the investigator, wrote something in a small notebook and did not look up. My mother watched her write it. I watched my mother watch her. And I saw the exact moment Carol understood that the woman with the badge was not a guest at a family disagreement. She was a witness at a record. My father set his thermos down on my side table. He didn't pick it back up. For once in his life, there was nothing to lift it over. Every denial dug them deeper. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do. The hostess slipped. The woman who gave to the church and wept at funerals and said anything for my mother into every microphone looked at the pages on my coffee table and at her own mother sitting upright and clear-eyed in the chair, and the performance cracked straight down the middle. She didn't even know what year it was, Carol snapped. What does she need a house for? The room went silent. Not stunned. Silent. The kind of silence with a floor that drops out of it. My mother heard herself a half-second too late. Her hand came up to her mouth. The investigator by the bookcase wrote something down without looking up. Joan didn't move. Trevor's easy smile was gone, and he wasn't looking at anyone now. He was looking at the door. My father was looking at his shoes. And my grandmother, Ruth Calloway, 90 years old, set her folded hands on the arms of the chair and pushed herself up to standing. "I knew enough to raise you," she said to her daughter, her voice even and unhurried. "I know enough now." The man by the door stepped forward and held out the envelope. "Ma'am," he said, "this freezes the sale." My grandmother crossed the room to me. She took my hand. 1, 2, 3. My grandmother stood up and said my name. For 30 years, I'd waited for someone in that family to defend me, and it turned out I'd had it backward the whole time. I didn't need defending. I needed to stop being silent. And the woman they drugged into a wheelchair had just done both. For both of us, without raising her voice. My mother turned to me then. Her eyes were wet now. Fast, the way she could always summon it. The script flipped to its last page. "After everything I've done for this family," she began, "after everything and here is the thing I want you to understand. The thing it took me my whole life to learn. I did not need her to understand. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I didn't list the window or the apron or the year my grandmother spent drowning. I looked at the woman who'd called me good with the dying, and I stopped calling her what I'd called her since before I could read. "You're not Mom in this house, Carol," I said. "You're the woman who poisoned her own mother for a house, and you're leaving." Trevor was already gathering his coat, already on his phone, already managing the next thing. Men like Trevor are never standing in the room they're standing in. My father stood up slowly and would not look at me, and on his way out, he stopped in front of my grandmother's chair, opened his mouth, found nothing in it, and walked out with his eyes on the floor. My mother was the last to move. I walked to the door and opened it and held it. "I'm not trading anything with you anymore," I said. "The door's behind you." I stopped needing them to understand. If you've ever had to say a sentence like that, quiet, final, to someone who was supposed to love you, and no one in the room clapped, and you went home and shook anyway. I want to hear about it. Tell me below. I'm telling you this so you know you're not the only one who had to learn to stop explaining. The folder did the rest, exactly the way Joan said it would. In the weeks that followed, the paper went to work in rooms I never had to enter. A judge voided the transfers. A deed and a power of attorney signed by a woman without capacity are worth nothing, no matter how good the notary. The house sale didn't just stall. It died, and the little paid-off house with the windowsill went back into my grandmother's name, where it had always belonged. The $412,000 became the subject of a restitution order, with my grandmother's name on the right side of it for once. Adult Protective Services substantiated the case. The word substantiated does a lot of quiet work. It means the system looked and agreed and wrote it down. And Trevor, with his spotless record, who told me to leave the numbers to people who understood them. Trevor was a licensed financial advisor, and my grandmother had been his client, and there are people whose entire job is what he did to her. The complaint went to the state securities regulator and to his firm's compliance office, and a man who built his whole self on a clean reputation watched that reputation come apart in the one place he couldn't charm his way out of. His spotless record? Joan told me, almost gently, the day she called with the news. It has a stain. Now they can't scrub. My mother's world got smaller in the quiet way these things happen. The same church where she'd collected sympathy at a sheet cake party started returning her calls slower, and then not at all, because the financial exploitation of an elderly parent is the rare sin even a forgiving congregation struggles to spin. The county attorney's office opened a file of its own. That part moves slowly, the way the law does, but it moves. No one came to my house in handcuffs that summer. I want to be honest about that, because the movies promise a moment that real life rarely delivers. What real life delivered instead was steadier, and in the end, heavier. A record, a paper trail, a reputation that would walk into every room ahead of my mother and my brother-in-law for the rest of their lives, and arrive before they did. The paper had done the talking. My sister Stephanie came to my door alone one evening. No kids, no overnight bag, her hands empty. I'd told her the truth by then, privately, the way she deserved, sitting at my kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, going cold between us. Every page, no weapon, just the truth. She'd left Trevor before I finished the second cup. Now she stood on my step, looking 10 years older and somehow more like the sister I'd had before the gold paint went on. "You tried to tell me," Stephanie said. Her voice did the thing voices do when they've been holding for a long time. "Years ago. About him, about all of it, and I called you bitter. I didn't make it easy for her, and I didn't make it hard. I held the door open. A different kind of open than the one I'd held for our mother. We start small," I said. "That's all I can promise." She nodded. We didn't hug. We sat on the step in the cooling air, 2 women who'd been raised in the same lie, and we started small. It hasn't been clean since. Some days, my sister Stephanie still flinches at the word sorry, like it costs her something to keep saying it. And some days, I catch the old reflex in myself, the one that wants to take care of everyone in the room so no one's angry. We're both unlearning things our mother spent decades teaching. But Stephanie reads to Maeve now, and she brings her kids to my kitchen, and the 4-day silences turned into 4-hour ones, and then into the ordinary, forgettable gaps of people who simply have lives. As for my mother, I see Carol at a distance, twice a year maybe, in the careful, supervised way you keep a door from slamming without opening it all the way. She has never apologized. I have never asked her to. I stopped needing that the afternoon I held my own front door open. Forgiveness isn't a door you fling open. That summer, the violet bloomed. It put out a crown of purple in the deep windowsill of a house that was finally, fully ours. And my grandmother sat in the good light with my daughter on her knees and told her the kind of long, looping stories that have no point except love. Brenda came by sometimes, off the clock, and Dr. Whitman dropped in once with a plant of his own as a housewarming gift, and a couple of nurses I'd worked with for years filled my kitchen with noise. I stopped waiting to be let back into the family I'd come from. I built a new one out of the people who'd actually shown up. It was a strange, good summer. My grandmother taught Brenda's youngest to play gin rummy at my kitchen table, cheated outrageously, got caught, and didn't care. Maeve learned to grab a fistful of the violet's leaves, and had to be gently relocated from the windowsill, again and again, while Ruth narrated her crimes. Dr. Whitman's housewarming plant turned out to be a tomato seedling, which my grandmother declared a personal insult to a woman who'd kept a garden for 60 years. And then she nursed it on the back step until it gave us more tomatoes than 3 households could eat. We handed them over fences to the neighbors. We had enough, for once, to give away. Ruth caught me watching them all one afternoon. 3 generations, a full table, the light coming in, and I had to turn toward the window for a second because the violet went blurry and I needed it to stop. "You brought me back," my grandmother said, squeezing the baby's small foot in time. 1, 2, 3. "Now watch me spoil this child." We grow what others throw away. I want to leave you with this, because I know some of you have been the helper too. My name is Danny Halloran. For most of my life, other people held the pen that wrote down who I was. The one who cleaned up, the one who wasn't cut out for more, the one who was good with the dying. They left a few things off that list on purpose, so let me say the whole of it now, in my own hand. I'm a nurse. I'm my daughter's mother. I'm the woman who kept her grandmother's life from being sold off in pieces. I'm the one who keeps her word, and I'm the one who watches. You don't need their permission to be worth something. You don't need them to clap or apologize or finally understand. You don't even need them to leave. You only need to stop handing them the pen. They thought I was good with the dying. They forgot I was watching the whole time. I am the one who watches.